students of 4th semester, Department of English, Assam University Deepu Campus. On the occasion of my birthday tomorrow, the 18th of April, I would like to forward this lecture on new poetry and the contribution of Nissim Ezekiel for your benefit in the forthcoming examination. Together with A.K. Ramanujan, Jayanta Mahapatra, R. Parthasarathi and Kamla Das, Nissim Ezekiel is unanimously acclaimed as a powerful pillar of new poetry in Indian writing in English. This new generation of poets tended to interrogate the romantic exuberance of Sarojini Naidu, Taru Datta, the mystical note and metaphysical preoccupation of Rabindranath Tagore and C. Aurobindo. The principal objective of new poetry in India was to replace the philosophical and metaphysical trends of abstract poetry in favor of a poetry deeply rooted in concrete experience. At the same time, with the achievement of India's independence from British hegemony, the new poets got a powerful fillip for ventilating their patriotic fervor, nationalistic spirit, and new cultural consciousness for appropriating their resurgent Indian sensibility. They also looked for new methods of experiments in form and technique of poetry taking place in America, England, and France. In this connection, Bruce King, in his book Modern Indian Poetry in English, published by Oxford University Press, New Delhi, 1987, aptly observes that the new poets incorporated into their poetry the spirit of disillusionment, despair, and loss of faith in modern life and the modern civilization. They looked for free and frank expression of genuine emotions and feeling from the confessional poetry of Sylvia Plath of America. And in this respect, Kamla Das has been rightly acclaimed as the Sylvia Plath of India for her serious confessional undertones and protest against patriarchy and ritual of torture on women in her poetry. At the same time, the new poets tended to look inward so as to unravel the delicate strands of the complex human psyche under the influence of Freudian and Jungian psychology. On the one hand, they nourished a compelling desire to celebrate humanism in the backdrop of the two world wars and meticulously articulated the joys and sorrows of the real world of industrialization, urbanization, and mechanical way of life that overtook idealism. On the other hand, cynicism and satire, ironic dig at hollowed human existence, and breaking of dreams and illusions occupied the center stage under the impact of Marxism, existentialism, phenomenology, surrealism, and the new aesthetics. In the hands of the new poets, new Renaissance humanism got preference to contest medieval negation of life. The traditional beliefs and irrational elements in Hindu culture were more often than not ridiculed, and emphasis was laid on the immediacy of experience and the poet's ready response to his immediate environment. Furthermore, the new poets did not believe in mere spiritual transcendence, but tended to transcend the limitations of life, transmuting ordinary experiences into art. P. Lal, in his poetic manifesto of Calcutta Writers' Workshop that published poetry of Nissim Ezekiel, Kamla Das, A.K. Ramanujan, Keshav Malik and Pritish Nandi underlines that new poetry should affirm our faith in a vital language dealing with concrete terms and concrete experiences. Whether intellectual or emotional, these experiences must be, according to Lal, lucidly and evocatively expressed. Lal further maintains that creative literature must be free from propaganda and that experiments in form and technique should not need to unnecessary excessive obscurity, eccentricity and ambiguity. Nissim Ezekiel was primarily an urban poet in whom one finds the intellectual dexterity of a professor of English and the profound depth of a philosophic mind. Ezekiel, as a professor of English, was profoundly influenced by both British and American poets, along with the French symbolists. And first of all, we locate Ezekiel's theory of poetry in W.B.Yeats' poetic theory and aesthetics as well. Like W.B.Yeats, Ezekiel believes that poets, like women, must labor to be beautiful, and his poem under the title Poet, Lover, Bird Watcher from Collected Poems is a case in point. It is in this poem that Ezekiel observes, I quote, "The best poets wait for words," unquote. They sit in silence by the flowing river or like a lover waiting for his beloved. Like Yeats, Ezekiel created his own love isle of Innisfree. He dreams of morning walks in silence, and as an urban poet, his poems included in collected poems justify his realistic outlook and temper. And Ezekiel has been profoundly influenced by the realistic notes of despair and disillusionment, as is evident in T.S. Eliot's poetry. And in Ezekiel shares Eliot's diagnosis of human loneliness and degeneration of values as shown in the Westland, and his poems like Urban, Morning Walk and Island justify Bombay as a barbaric city, which is strongly reminiscent of Eliot's picture of the London as the unreal city. Eliot's unreal city in London is close parallel in Ezekiel's Bombay, a city of barbarity. At the same time, behind Ezekiel's picture of Bombay as a barbaric city, one also locates Baudelaire's depiction of Paris, apart from Eliot's depiction of London as the city of hollowness and the city of dehumanization. Ezekiel's hybrid colonial city, I mean Bombay, epitomizes all the tensions and corruptions which had engulfed the major European capitals after the First World War. In the face of a complete collapse of Western culture, as is evident from T.S. Eliot's seminal line, London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. And Ezekiel also sings in the following lines, I quote, "Shall I set at least my legs in order?" And Ezekiel's protagonist is therefore disturbed by the clamor of the urban life. And it is now evident that as a realistic poet, Ezekiel is admittedly secular. He is a poet of the body and a ceaseless explorer of the labyrinths of mind, and that is precisely the reason why sentiments and emotions and abstract sublimity are replaced in his poetry by feelings of isolation, alienation, search for truth, and realization of the self, with a sophisticated sense of irony. In his poetry, Bombay is described as a city of hollowness, a city of barbaric behavior, whether it is his first volume, Time to Change, or his collected poems, or The Unfinished Man. Ezekiel's modernist poetic sensibility is enriched with an intellectual communication of experience grounded in reality. For instance, in the poem Ganga, he presents with a typical ironic understatement the predicament of a maidservant caught between poverty and hypocritical generosity of her family members. In the poem The Patriot, he is under the profound influence of Indian nationalism and Gandhian thought, and in the poem Background Casually, he makes an ironic presentation of his own disillusionment in the context of the modern society. Apart from Eliot and W.B. Yeats, Ezra Pound was also profoundly influenced by the American poet Ezra Pound and the English poet Philip Larkin. From Ezra Pound, Ezekiel imbibed the imagist technique, both thematically and technically. And from Philip Larkin, the movement poet, Ezekiel imbibed the art of precision, common subject matter, lucidity, and exposition of hypocrisy of the society in plain and lucid terms. For Ezekiel, as it is for Philip Larkin, poetry is no propaganda, and it is unlike the poets of the 30s, is not a social platform for criticism. And in that sense, Ezekiel is profoundly influenced by Philip Larkin's simplicity and lucidity of expression. With this background of new poetry, let us move on to the famous poem Enterprise by Ezekiel. In the poem Enterprise, the poet clearly states his objective in the opening line that life is essentially a journey, more predominantly a spiritual journey. And unlike a physical journey, it is a spiritual journey that exalts mind and elevates thoughts and makes the burden of the heavy world of complex reality light, thereby illumining the soul towards a beatific vision. I quote the poem. It started as a pilgrimage, exalting minds and making all the burdens light. Unquote. The opening lines can be intertextually negotiated with Wordsworth's emphasis on blessed mood, elevated thought, and bliss of solitude, characteristic of the mind of an Indian yogi, as is adumbrated in his monumental poem Tinterneve. At the same time, the opening lines signifying a journey, which is also justified from the very title Enterprise, meaning spiritual endeavor, reminds us of W.B. Yeats' sailing from the world of texting reality to the ideal world of the golden bar or the golden bow in the poem Sailing to Byzantium. On the other hand, T.S. Eliot's three wise men who started a journey from the east undertaking a spiritual endeavor to see the birth of Jesus as Bethlehem can also be negotiated for a satisfactory comparative assessment of the poem Enterprise, keeping in mind W.B. Yeats' Sailing to Byzantium, Wordsworth's Tinterneve, and T.S. Eliot's Journey of the Magi. The poem Enterprise entails different stages of the journey, whereas the first stage is one of physical and mental preparation. The second stage is one of exploration. But the exploration does not succeed, as the call could not be tested because of physical impediments signified by the turbulent sun that stands for suffering and obstacles on the path of spiritual pilgrimage, thereby igniting travelers. As the poem proceeds, suffering makes the travelers wiser, and the poet makes it clear in the opening lines of the second stanza. I quote, "We stood it very well, I thought," unquote. In course of their journey, the travelers observed so many things and made copious noting of the fact that the pigeons sold and bought, the serpents and goats, all pointing to the experiences of a rural landscape. The last line of the second stanza, I quote, "Three cities where a sage had taught," is philosophically complex. It has both secular and spiritual implications. As the journey progresses, the unity of the travelers and the mental stability both experienced fissures because of temperamental differences that arose as to how to cross a desert. Here, one is once again reminded of the hardship of the three Magi in the poem A Journey of the Magi by T.S. Eliot. Differences obviously crop up when hardship and sufferings are experienced, and the real blame game starts because everyone wants to showcase himself or herself as pure and Mr. Clean. In the course of their ordeal of suffering in the desert, the poet candidly states how these travelers lost a potential friend of creative talent whose stylish prose was quite the best of all our beds. There is a personal touch here, as the dead friend seems to be a bosom friend of the poet himself, and the nature of the enterprise as a journey of the writers seems to be more appropriate than it being the journey of some pure spiritual pilgrims. Be that as it may, the dark shadow of the inescapable clutches of death casts its gloom on the mind and heart of the travelers. After the suffering in the desert and the death of a friend, the third stage of the poem begins with another ordeal of suffering, attack on the pilgrims who, out of fear, ran here and there and lost their way. Subsequently, there developed fissures and disagreement among the travelers, and some of them exercised their option of liberty to withdraw from the journey. The poet was ready to pray for their unity. Even the leader of the trip was found confused and unstable, which signifies that the spiritual journey is going to be a disastrous failure. And chaos and confusion ruled supreme in their minds, and bereft of definite direction, and with divided minds and hearts, these travelers were no better than a straggling crowd of little hope. I quote from the text. Unmindful of divine instructions and indications signified by, I quote, what the thunder meant, unquote. Strongly reminiscent of the message of the thunder in Eliot's masterpiece, The Wasteland, and the doubts and crises experienced by the three Magi in Eliot's another poem, The Journey of the Magi. These travelers in Ezekiel's poem Enterprise reveal the fundamental human condition experienced by the modern man, who is awfully unfit for any spiritual journey. As Eliot rightly says in Hollow Man, the modern man is nothing but a hollow man. I quote, we are the hollow man, our headpieces filled with straw, unquote. Ezekiel's message here is that in a world where God is dead, an idea of Nietzsche, and where divinity is caricatured as Godot, strongly reminiscent of Samuel Beckett's play Waiting for Godot, spiritual journey is an anathema rather than a blessing. Moreover, people with divided aims, fluctuating minds and hearts, bereft of faith and absolute devotion, are unqualified for any spiritual enterprise. The title is therefore decidedly ironical, and this is evident from the last stanza of the poem. I quote, when finally we reached the place, we hardly knew why we were there. The trip had darkened every face. Our deeds were neither great nor rare. Home is where we have to gather grace, unquote. By the time the travelers reached the place of destination, the poet says that some were already broken and some were already bent with exhaustion. And more painful than anything else is that the travelers had hardly retained the charm of spirituality and the hope of a spiritual pilgrimage with which they had started the enterprise. The beginning was so promising, and the end is so devastating and tantalizing. The trip had darkened every face, and the journey was not great nor spectacular at all, and as they did not attain spiritual realization or bliss. This is how the enterprise began with optimism and ended with a tantalizing failure. The poem ends with a disappointing Christian realization, signified by the line, I quote, home is where we have to gather grace, unquote. Here home signifies the abode of divinity or spiritual beatitude, which is impossible in the absence of true devotion, full faith and wholehearted surrender. In a world dominated by doubts and skepticism, lack of devotion and unflinching faith and tenacity to bear with suffering, spiritual journey is bound to lead to frustration, bereft of grace. Thank you.